When a Hollywood titan, a living legend whose name alone carries the weight of an entire cinematic era, steps into a morning television studio, he expects the familiar rhythms of polite conversation and promotional courtesy. He anticipates soft lighting, gentle applause, and questions that glide safely along the surface of his legacy. What he does not expect is combat. What he does not foresee is being thrust into the arena for the most brutal intellectual confrontation of his long and storied career. Yet that is precisely what unfolded on a morning that would go on to fracture the illusion of live television itself. You are about to bear witness to a moment that shattered the very foundation of daytime broadcasting. What began as a routine promotional appearance spiraled into a raw, visceral confrontation, one that left a nation frozen in stunned silence. It ended with one of America's most revered actors rising from his chair and walking off the set, his disgust unmistakable, his disappointment etched deeply into every line of his weathered face. Join the Legion by hitting that subscribe button, and descend into the comments to declare your verdict on this chaos, because what transpired that morning has already begun to pass into legend. The day began with deceptive tranquility at the Good Morning America studios, nestled in the pulsing heart of Times Square. Outside, the city roared as it always did, taxis honking, pedestrians weaving through crowds, digital billboards flashing endless spectacles of light and commerce. Inside the studio, however, everything appeared calm, controlled, and meticulously rehearsed. Clint Eastwood, the myth himself, had arrived to herald his latest directorial vision. Industry insiders whispered that this stark, unforgiving Western was more than just another film. Some dared to call it his magnum opus, a triumphant and deliberate return to the raw moral landscapes that had defined his early career. The studio hummed with orchestrated chaos. Makeup artists applied their final, near-invisible touches, adjusting powder and shadow with surgical precision. Producers glided across the polished floor like battlefield generals, issuing quiet commands through headsets, checking timing, watching the clock. Every movement was purposeful. Every second was accounted for. At the center of it all sat a small, unassuming table, one that would soon be transformed into a battleground. Across that table sat George Stephanopoulos, one of the most seasoned figures in American broadcast journalism. His notes were arranged with the discipline of a master strategist, pages neatly stacked, questions highlighted and underlined. When the cameras went live, their red lights glowing like watchful eyes, millions of viewers across the country tuned in. They expected warmth, they expected nostalgia, they expected reverence for a Hollywood immortal. "Good morning, Clint. Thanks for being with us today," Stephanopoulos began, his smile polished and perfectly calibrated for television. "I must admit, at 94 years young, you're still creating, still commanding from the director's chair, still gracing the screen. What's the fuel for this fire that continues to burn so fiercely at this chapter of your life?" Eastwood leaned back slightly in his chair, composed and unhurried, a king settled upon his throne. The iconic squint, touched by decades of sunlight, dust, and determination, cast a subtle shadow beneath the harsh studio lights. His presence was unmistakable. This was a man who had defined heroes and anti-heroes, who had stared down villains and moral ambiguity alike. When he spoke, his voice emerged as a low rumble of gravel and experience, steady and unembellished. "Well, George," he said calmly, "I suppose it comes down to a love for the craft of storytelling. It always has. When you discover your purpose, age becomes an irrelevant number. I wake up each day thinking about the next vision, the next sequence to capture, the next story crying out to be told." The words landed with quiet authority, resonating deeply with viewers at home. Stephanopoulos nodded appreciatively. "That's profoundly inspiring," he replied, but to the trained ear something had shifted. Beneath the surface of civility, there was a subtle tightening in the air, a faint but unmistakable omen that the pleasantries were merely a prelude. The tone changed almost imperceptibly, like the moment before a storm breaks. "Your new picture," Stephanopoulos continued, "much like your legendary westerns, delves into the eternal struggle between justice and morality. But some critics argue that your portrayal of these themes reflects an outdated worldview, one that no longer aligns with modern sensibilities. How do you respond to those who say your films romanticize a past that should be left behind, The studio seemed to hold its breath. Eastwood's expression hardened, not with anger, but with something deeper resolve. He leaned forward now, his hands resting firmly on the table. "I don't make films to chase trends," he replied evenly. "I make them to ask questions that don't change with time. Justice, responsibility, consequence, those aren't outdated ideas, they're human ones." As the exchange intensified, it became clear this was no longer a promotional interview. It was a philosophical clash between generations, between evolving cultural narratives, and a man who had spent a lifetime exploring moral complexity without apology. Each question cut sharper than the last. Each answer carried the weight of decades. When Eastwood finally rose from his chair, the decision was not impulsive. It was deliberate, a statement in itself. Without raising his voice, without theatrics, he simply said, "This isn't why I came here," and walked off the set. The cameras kept rolling. The nation watched, and in that moment, live television was changed forever. Do you believe those grand themes resonate in a different key with today's audience compared to when you first rode onto the scene back in the 60s? George Stephanopoulos asked, his voice smooth but carefully calibrated. Clint Eastwood did not answer immediately. He paused, motionless, like a statue carved from granite, his hands calmly folded in his lap. The silence stretched just long enough to become meaningful. In a medium where seconds are currency, the pause itself was a statement. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet certainty that seemed immune to the ticking clock. "I believe a powerful story transcends time, George," Eastwood said. "The human heart understands the difference between right and wrong. It recognizes the moment a man must stand for his convictions, the moment he must draw a line in the sand. That truth is eternal. I don't see that ever changing." Stephanopoulos nodded, acknowledging the response, but his fingers shuffled his notes with casual precision. To the untrained eye, it was an innocuous gesture. To seasoned observers of broadcast combat, it was unmistakable, the signal of a hunter changing tactics. "Human nature is a constant," Stephanopoulos remarked lightly, an interesting viewpoint. Then came the pivot, and speaking of standing for one's convictions. He continued, his tone subtly sharpening, "You've been anything but silent about your political leanings through the years. You've championed candidates, addressed conventions, and delivered statements that ignited national debates." The stoic mask on Eastwood's face did not crack, but something shifted beneath the surface. A practiced insider would have noticed it immediately, the minute tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible adjustment of posture. His attention sharpened, the iron gaze hardened, signaling that the terrain had changed. "I've always held that participating in our democracy is essential," Eastwood replied evenly. "I believe every American possesses both the right and the sacred duty to ensure their voice is heard." "But your voice," Stephanopoulos interjected, pressing forward now, "has often been a controversial one." The studio air seemed to thin. The incident with the empty chair. Stephanopoulos continued, "Your repeated declarations on political correctness, your stance on some of the most defining social issues of our time. Does a titan like you ever question taking such unwavering political positions, knowing they may fracture the very audience that comes to see your films?" The question lingered in the air like a challenge thrown at Eastwood's feet. For a moment, the only sign of reaction was the tightening of his jaw. Then he spoke, and the warmth in his voice was gone. What remained was something colder, forged from decades of defiance and survival. "George, I speak on what I believe must be spoken," Eastwood said. "I don't lose sleep over who agrees and who doesn't. I've navigated this industry for over 60 years, and in that time, I've learned a fundamental truth: you'll never satisfy everyone. You cannot create art by consensus, and you certainly cannot live a life tiptoeing around the risk of causing offense." The words landed heavily, but Stephanopoulos did not retreat. If anything, he appeared energized, sensing what he believed to be a fracture in the armor. "Surely," he pressed, "with such immense influence comes an equally immense responsibility." It was a clear rejection of Eastwood's defense. "When a man of your legendary status speaks," Stephanopoulos continued, "those words echo. They shape minds. They influence culture. Do you not feel a moral imperative to wield that power with greater caution?" Eastwood leaned forward now, deliberately, like a predator focusing on its prey. The iconic steely gaze locked onto the interviewer, unwavering. "Caution with my words," Eastwood replied. "George, I've been cautious with my words my entire life. I've chosen every single role, every single project, every public statement with immense deliberation. But being cautious is not the same as being muzzled, and it is certainly not an apology for holding a conviction." The atmosphere in the studio thickened, charged with tension so dense it felt almost visible. Camera operators exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to hold the shot or pull back. In the control room, producers hunched over their monitors, whispering urgently into headsets. This interview had officially gone off script. The pleasant promotional conversation was dead and buried. Yet Stephanopoulos, far from backing down, appeared to draw strength from Eastwood's resistance. He glanced down at his notes again, not as a journalist now, but as a general reviewing a battle plan. When he looked up, there was a glint in his eyes, an unmistakable shift from interview to interrogation. "Allow me to be more precise, Clint," Stephanopoulos said, his voice now carrying the sharp, prosecutorial edge of a courtroom cross-examination. "Over the years, you've made statements that have caused considerable alarm, statements concerning minorities, concerning women, concerning the very arc of social progress itself." The studio fell silent. Every eye was fixed on Eastwood, waiting for the response. This was no longer about film. It was no longer about legacy. It was about ideology, power, and whether a living legend would bend or break under the weight of modern scrutiny. The nation watched as history hovered on the edge of a single reply. "You've waved away calls for equality as political correctness run amok," Stephanopoulos said, his voice now stripped of pretense. "How does that man align with the heroes of justice you portray on the silver screen, the men who champion the downtrodden, who shield the innocent, who rise against oppression when no one else will?" The transformation was instant. Clint Eastwood's expression hardened into something unmovable, a granite mask forged by decades of discipline and defiance. The amiable industry legend, the elder statesman of Hollywood, the wise storyteller, reflecting fondly on a lifetime of work, vanished completely. In his place stood the same unyielding presence that had defined 100 cinematic showdowns. The gunslinger, the lawman, the man who did not flinch. "George," Eastwood said sharply, his voice clipped and cold, "you are twisting my words, and frankly, I find that insinuation deeply offensive." A ripple of unease passed through the studio. "I have dedicated my entire career," Eastwood continued, leaning forward now, to telling stories about men who do what is right, men who confront tyrants, men who stand up when others look away, men who defend those who cannot defend themselves. My personal convictions are not in conflict with that legacy. They are in perfect harmony with it." The conviction in his voice was unmistakable. This was not a man improvising. This was a man speaking from a position he had occupied his entire life. But Stephanopoulos did not retreat. "Are they, though?" He fired back, the counterpunch swift, precise, and devastatingly timed. The question cut through the air like a blade. Because when you write off legitimate cries against systemic injustice as mere political correctness, Stephanopoulos pressed, "Are you not, in effect, silencing the victims of genuine discrimination? Are you telling them their lived reality is irrelevant, and isn't that, at its core, the very definition of bullying, the kind of abuse your on-screen heroes would rise up to destroy?" The studio froze. The question landed with the force of a physical blow. For a long, breathless beat, Eastwood did not respond. The silence was deafening. His jaw muscles worked slowly, visibly, as though grinding against decades of restraint. The camera lingered on his face, catching every flicker of tension, every micro-expression that betrayed the internal battle unfolding beneath the surface. This was no longer a debate of ideas. It was an attack on identity. Eastwood inhaled deeply, the kind of breath taken by a man steadying himself before stepping into gunfire. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled, but beneath it ran an unmistakable current of fury. "You're operating under a false premise," he said. "I have never dismissed anyone's pain, not once. What I reject is the idea that complex human struggles can be reduced to slogans, or weaponized to shut down conversation." Stephanopoulos raised an eyebrow, pressing the advantage. "But isn't that exactly what you're accused of doing?" he asked, shutting down conversation by labeling it political correctness. Eastwood's eyes narrowed. "No," he replied firmly. "What I oppose is moral laziness. I oppose a culture that replaces accountability with outrage and dialogue with accusation. Justice is not served by shouting people into silence. It's served by truth, by courage, and by the willingness to confront uncomfortable realities, even when they don't fit neatly into a narrative." The tension in the studio thickened, coiling like a live wire. Crew members shifted uneasily. A cameraman subtly adjusted his angle, sensing history unfolding in real time. In the control room, producers exchanged alarmed looks. This exchange was moving fast, too fast to rein in. But the people who experience discrimination, Stephanopoulos countered, would argue that those narratives are their lived experiences, that dismissing the language they use is another way of denying their humanity. Eastwood straightened fully now, his posture commanding, unyielding. "No one denies their humanity," he said. "But humanity also includes disagreement. It includes nuance. It includes the freedom to question ideas without being branded immoral. The heroes I've portrayed don't defend people by silencing others. They defend them by standing for principle, even when it's unpopular." The words echoed with unmistakable finality, yet Stephanopoulos was relentless. "But doesn't real power," he asked, "demand greater sensitivity? When you speak, people listen. When you dismiss movements for equality, those words carry consequences." Eastwood's lips pressed into a thin line. His patience, legendary in its own right, was visibly eroding. "I do not dismiss equality," he said, each word measured. "I dismiss ideological coercion. I dismiss the notion that morality must be dictated by the loudest voices in the room. Equality without freedom of thought is not justice. It's conformity." A murmur rippled through the studio audience. For a moment, Stephanopoulos hesitated, sensing the edge of something dangerous, but instead of pulling back, he leaned in. "So you don't believe your rhetoric emboldens those who resist social progress?" he asked. That was the line. Eastwood's eyes locked onto him, sharp and unwavering. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "I believe," Eastwood said quietly, "that social progress built on silencing dissent is fragile, and I will not apologize for refusing to participate in that." Silence followed, thick, heavy, absolute. This was no longer an interview. It was a philosophical standoff between generations, worldviews, and definitions of justice itself. A living legend sat under interrogation, refusing to bend. A veteran journalist pressed forward, convinced history demanded accountability, and in that moment, everyone in the room understood the truth. This confrontation was headed somewhere irreversible. Eastwood sat motionless, wrestling a storm of fury into submission. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, as if the air itself were holding its breath. His chest rose and fell slowly, deliberately, a man forcing discipline upon raw emotion. When he finally spoke, his voice emerged as a low, controlled growl, rumbling with the thunder of rage barely kept behind locked gates. "Now you listen to me, George," Eastwood said, every word carved from steel. "Never, not for 1 second in my entire life, have I ever told another human being that their experience doesn't matter." The intensity in his gaze was unmistakable. "I've built my crews and my casts with people from every walk of life," he continued. "Different backgrounds, different beliefs, different struggles. I've spent decades chronicling the human condition from every conceivable angle, and I have always strived to treat every soul I encounter with dignity and respect." His voice rose slightly, not in volume, but in force. "But I will not apologize for believing that the pendulum has swung to a dangerous extreme," Eastwood said, "an extreme where good, thoughtful people now live in fear of speaking honestly, where one wrong word can erase a lifetime of decency, where disagreement is treated as cruelty." The studio crackled with tension. Stephanopoulos saw it then, the opening, a fracture in the Titan's armor. He leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. "But doesn't speaking your mind," he pressed, "often come at the cost of another person's pain?" His posture shifted, physically embodying the challenge. "When you trivialize seismic movements like Me Too or Black Lives Matter," Stephanopoulos continued, "you're not simply voicing a contrarian opinion. You're diminishing profound suffering. You're diminishing real injustice. How is that truly different from the antagonists in your own films? The men who sidestep the suffering of others for their own comfort and gain. That comparison landed like a gunshot. Eastwood's hands clamped onto the arms of his chair, his knuckles draining of all color. The accusation was no longer ideological. It was personal, a direct strike at the moral foundation of a legend built over decades. "That's enough, George," Eastwood snapped. The words cut through the studio like a blade. "You're fabricating statements. You're twisting my entire life's work to fit a prepackaged narrative you've already decided on," he said, his voice shaking with controlled fury. "I have never made light of anyone's suffering." He leaned forward now, his eyes blazing. "Never," he repeated. But Stephanopoulos did not back down. If anything, he pressed harder. "Haven't you, though?" he challenged. "When you mock the very idea of safe spaces, when you dismiss trigger warnings, when you lament political correctness, aren't you, in essence, telling people who have been broken that their trauma is an inconvenience, something they should simply get over?" The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. "Isn't that," Stephanopoulos concluded, "the precise kind of callous indifference that the heroes you created would find utterly despicable?" That was the breaking point. Eastwood snapped. The legendary composure, the discipline that had carried him through 6 decades of fame, scrutiny, and power, shattered like glass. "You're damn right," Eastwood shot back, his voice rising for the first time. "I think people need to toughen up." Gasps rippled through the studio. "Life is hard," he continued. "It always has been, and pretending otherwise doesn't make it kinder. It makes it weaker. I don't believe we help people by wrapping them in cotton and telling them the world will bend around their pain." Stephanopoulos tried to interject, but Eastwood was done yielding ground. "The men I've portrayed," Eastwood said, standing taller in his chair, "didn't survive because the world protected them. They survived because they faced reality head on, because they endured, because they found strength, not excuses." The room was electric. "You want to call that indifference?" Eastwood demanded. "Fine, I call it respect. I respect people enough to believe they are stronger than the labels you pin on them." The control room was in chaos now. Producers whispered urgently into headsets. Camera operators hesitated, unsure whether to pull back or stay locked on the unraveling moment. This was no longer television as usual. This was a live detonation. Stephanopoulos, visibly rattled but unwilling to retreat, tried once more. But when powerful voices say things like that, he argued, they can embolden cruelty, they can justify dismissal of pain. Eastwood exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "What emboldens cruelty," he said, "is teaching people that they are fragile, that they are powerless, that words are violence and disagreement is oppression. That's not justice, it's a lie." A stunned silence followed. Every camera was trained on Eastwood now. The nation watched a living legend lay bare his world. "You, unfiltered, unapologetic, and defiant. And I won't be cast as the villain in your morality play," Eastwood finished. "And not today, not ever." The air hung heavy, thick with the realization that this confrontation had crossed a line from which there was no return. Everyone in the room knew it. This interview was no longer salvageable. It was moments away from collapse.